This is the Carolina Catholic Homeschool Showcase. Now, here's your host, Elizabeth Hadi.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Catholic Homeschool Showcase, brought to you by Carolina Catholic Media. I'm your host, Elizabeth Hadi. I've been homeschooling my 5 children the past 10 years, and I also have the privilege of directing the Aquinas Charlotte Center, a classical homeschool hybrid program. This whole week, we are exploring the joys, the nuances, the facets of homeschooling in a classical way. Today, we are discussing the importance of logic, philosophy, and rhetoric in a classical homeschool curriculum. I'm joined today by Patrick Reilly, the president and founder of the Cardinal Newman Society. Patrick has authored and edited many articles, reports, studies, and other publications on Catholic education for the Newman Society and national media. He has appeared on EWTN, Fox News, MSNBC, and numerous radio programs. Patrick develops and teaches courses in logic, rhetoric, and philosophy for the Aquinas Learning Homeschool Program, founded by his wife, Rosario. He and his wife, Rosario, have 5 children and live in Manassas, Virginia. Thank you so much for joining me today, Patrick.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's great to be with you, and from so far away, and yet it's just great with this technology that we can, feels like we're in the same room.
Right, it's an amazing thing. So I'm going to just dive right in with some questions here. Mm-hmm. I'm told that you teach 3 courses at Aquinas Learning, and that these courses are rather uncommon for most high schoolers. They're logic, rhetoric, and philosophy. Would you mind telling me a little bit about that and how you got into it?
Sure. They weren't always uncommon, but certainly today they are. I basically got into it when my wife asked me to do it, which is how we get into the best things that we do, right? She runs the Manassas Center of Aquinas Learning, and started getting into teaching formal logic. I loved it. I did have a logic course in high school, which was unusual, and have just a great love for philosophy and for all of that. And so I really enjoyed it. Basically was using classical academic press textbooks, and over time have developed a little bit more of my own courses in all of these areas. But the logic then flowed into rhetoric. We wanted young people to really learn classical rhetoric. And then the philosophy course sort of flowed from that, because we wanted the older students to be able to take the logic and learn how to actually apply that to arguments, and how to learn something about the basic elements of language, which are are fundamental to good logical discussion and conversation.
Right, that makes sense. Now, I'm wondering if you've gotten this question before, because it does seem like, I know that these programs start in 7th grade, and that some people in the classical world, or even outside of it, might think that's a little bit young for studying logic. Often these classes are given later in high school, or even just in college. And then with philosophy as well, often that's just considered something you start focusing on the college level. And I think that in the classical world too, I've noticed that there sometimes can be a little bit of an emphasis on doing things because they're rigorous or might be considered prestigious. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, or if you think that all middle school and high schoolers should take these types of classes.
Yeah, well, certainly they ought to be considered prestigious, although, when you put it on a transcript for most colleges, it gets relegated to the electives, which I think is interesting, because these things are fundamental to not just to education and understanding, but to the actual formation of the person. And so the more we've gotten into this, the more we've realized how very, very important it is. I think that even in the 7th grade, which often the students are a little bit shocked, which 7th graders are always shocked, because they're moving up into this new level. At Aquinas Learning, we have 3-year cycles, and so that's the cycle where they really start to move into some of the higher level things. But they love it, and I find it such a joy to teach the 7th graders and the 8th graders, 9th graders, and all the way up through 12th. The high schoolers really embrace this. They want to know why. They have questions. They want to figure things out. They don't want to be taken for granted, and they don't want another 6 years of being thrown a lot of information without understanding. And so they really want to rise to these higher level thoughts, and it's a natural human inclination to do that. And yet I find that most education stifles that. And so it's a great age to get into this. And I truly believe the more I've done this, the more I've found that I think it's a crime that young people don't graduate from high school with a very clear understanding of reality, of how language works, of how we communicate, of being able to think logically and understand how that works, which is why we study logic instead of just doing it. And rhetoric, how to communicate well and how to get an argument across to someone, which today we see so many people are incapable of defending their own position. Everyone takes a position, but they can't defend it rationally. And then they're not able to therefore have a rational and a civil dialogue with each other. And so this is so very, very important. And they need it by the time they graduate high school. They need it before they go to college. And the reality is that most colleges today don't even teach this to the average student unless you major in philosophy and or English in the case of rhetoric. And so it's very, very important, I think, that we get to young people before they graduate high school.
Yes, well, I mean, I've definitely found that to be true with my own children. My oldest is in 8th grade now, and he has been taking the informal logic class and just loving it. And what's interesting too is seeing how his younger siblings are also really fascinated by it. And so of course they're starting to pick up all these different names of fallacies, and you could see how much they just sort of intuitively, naturally are drawn to it and interested in it, especially when it has to do with arguing, I think.
Yeah, especially when they can catch their parents in a fallacy, right? They love that. They just love that. And it's perfect for that age, right?
They do. Now, have you found that most students do well in these classes? Or do you find that it's really more appropriate for the more advanced students?
Yeah, I've been just so thrilled. I have a student in one of my classes who's dyslexic and struggles with that. I have another student who's somewhere on the autism spectrum and so has struggled with many of their classes, and yet they've done very well with these courses. I truly believe these are not advanced courses. These are basic courses. And if you go back into history just a few hundred years ago, and you read things that, even the average laborer would talk about and understand, they knew these things. They knew basic Aristotelian philosophy. They understood what the essence of a thing was and how that's separated from the accidents of a thing. They even understood the terminology. This was part of natural discourse at the time, and we've lost it all. And I can go into, that would be too long, but I could go into all the reasons why it seems that we've abandoned all of this, and I think it's been very deliberate. But we need to recover it, and it's one of the great things about classical education, that we're recovering these very, very important things.
Well, and that actually leads me to what was going to be my next question, which is if you think that there has been a deliberate move away from this, because it does seem, and based on what you're saying, that the fact that people cannot reason very well, and that they don't know how to think clearly and articulate what they're thinking clearly, that is, that's such a handicap. And
it is. Yeah.
And you think that, not only then can you be led astray so easily and manipulated so easily, but then you also are manipulated by your own emotions and passions,
right.
To your own detriment. And that just seems to be such a travesty.
Yeah, and there's a long history to this. It goes all the way back to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, to the Protestant Reformation, which, getting outside of any sort of theological judgments on that, there developed a radical distrust of authority, a radical distrust of big ideas, of those who would impose big ideas about justice and love and all of these big, high, important things. And unfortunately, our society today and education deliberately in public education theory tries to keep students from rising to that level, doing what Newman said was ascending over knowledge, trying to rise above information and to understand the bigger things about the world, which of course leads us further closer and closer to some kind of understanding of God. And there's just this radical distrust that has led our society to actually discourage young people from doing that, and instead living within their own experiences and never rising above that to general understandings, what we call universals. And that's just so very dangerous for all of humanity if we do that.
Yes. One more question for you right now before we have our break. How do you think logic, rhetoric, philosophy, how do you think they all fit into a classical education?
Yeah, I think there are essential components. There's this, when we talk about logic and to the students, we talk about logic as a science and an art. There's the art of actually doing logic, of reasoning, of thinking clearly. And that enters into how do we do rhetoric and how do we communicate truth to each other. And then of course, philosophy is sort of, the bigger understanding of things. And in our philosophy class, it's actually more of philosophy of nature and of language, of trying to understand what our language is and how it communicates true things about reality, that it's not just, meaningless utterances to each other. And so all of that is very, very important, studying in terms of the science of studying how we do these things. In terms of the actual doing these things, that goes all the way down to the day a child is born. I mean, we are, as humans, one of the things we learn in the philosophy class is that what distinguishes humans from other animals is our ability to reason. And that needs to be cultivated from the very early stages. And we try to do that in Aquinas learning as well, and throughout classical education. That's fundamental to what classical education is all about, what the Greeks were trying to do in the early years. And then when you add the insights of our faith into that education, it becomes a very, very rich and wonderful education that leads finally to these sciences of logic, of rhetoric, and philosophy, where we really try to go back and understand what it is that we as humans do in order to think clearly.
Well, one of the things when I was teaching the rhetoric class that you developed last year, and this was the first time I was even exposed to a rhetoric class. I never had one, when I was growing up or even in college. And I have to say, all the students, I think, loved that class. At the end of the year, several of the students came up to me and said, "We're so sad it's over. When are we going to take another rhetoric class?" But we all learned so much from that. But it was fascinating to me to read about and see how important rhetoric had been, going back to the Greeks and the Romans, and to see then, this emphasis that then once Christians started to kind of grapple with the ideas of rhetoric, how they were able to incorporate that in as well, and how Augustine and other saints really saw the value and importance of rhetoric to our faith. So just not only important in this classical sense and for classical education, but for a Christian education. So.
Yeah, it's so very important, and I too feel, when the rhetoric course is over, I miss it. I really miss all of these classes when they wrap up, but it's nice to have that final recognition that students have gained something. And it's, there's the old rhetoric, and then there's the rhetoric like from the founding of America. And you read these great orations that are only a couple hundred years old, and the average person in the street could listen to that oration and get so much out of it. And yet our students struggle with nearly every word of the vocabulary and the language and all of that. And so it just even heightens to me that just the great, great importance of getting at least, these young people who are in our care to a much higher level than unfortunately our current education has relegated most students to.
Yes. Well, and the syntax, I think, looking back at those speeches, right, the more complicated sentence structure, the more complicated kind of thoughts. And so it can be a little bit difficult, but it's such an important thing to be able to read something like that and understand it. Okay, well, it's time to take a short break here on Carolina Catholic Homeschool Showcase. Stay tuned and we'll be right back.
2022 is bringing many new and exciting changes to our Carolina Catholic Apostolate, built to communicate how to better learn, love, and live our Catholic faith. We begin with our name change to Carolina Catholic Media. This reflects the expanded scope of Carolina Catholic Radio to include the development of our podcast, streaming, social media, YouTube, and direct marketing platforms. 2022 is a very important year for the Catholic Church. As a result, Carolina Catholic Media will feature more local news, information, and conversation to reflect what's happening now and how it impacts our local Catholic community. Throughout the year, Carolina Catholic Media will showcase our Catholic schools and homeschools, the Charlotte Diocese 50th anniversary, and the 2-year worldwide synod process that begins on the diocesan level. We encourage you to get involved, join us, and catch the spirit. The Carolina Catholic Media Apostolate is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% funded by you. Please consider a donation, monthly tithe, or business sponsorship to support our mission and vision to spread the truth of Jesus Christ and our Catholic faith across the Carolinas. Thank you for discerning a role in our apostolate. May God bless you abundantly.
Okay, welcome back. This is Elizabeth Hadi, and joining me today is Patrick Reilly. We're here on the Carolina Catholic Homeschool Showcase, and we're discussing classical education and the importance of rhetoric, philosophy, and logic. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of these questions and understanding these courses that you've developed, Patrick. So first, I'd like to ask, is there a proper sequence to these courses?
There is certainly a proper sequence, and then there's of course the sequence that we use in Aquinas Learning, because we're on this 3-year cycle, which I think is just so great for families, where, you know, like with history, they every 3 years they're studying the same area of history, time period of history, and all the students of all the different ages are studying it, but of course at their different age level. With Aquinas Learning, we do basic formal logic, material logic, and then rhetoric for the 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. And then the 10th and 11th and 12th, we move into what we call great arguments, which is sort of an application and seeing how formal logic works in many of the great essays and arguments that have been made in history. And then we move into the philosophy and language course, which is, you know, sort of tied in at the same time as the material logic at the lower grades. And then we do an advanced rhetoric where students do a lot more of actually developing their own orations, and then also studying some pretty advanced orations from history.
Okay, would you mind just explaining for our listeners the difference between formal and informal and material logic? Yeah.
I actually counsel my students not to say informal for one reason. It's, there's formal logic and informal logic, or formal logic and material logic. I try to get them to use material only because it tells us a little bit more what it is. Logic, in terms of how we do logic, or how we study logic, how we study reasoning, the science of logic is divided into formal logic and material. Formal logic is the process of reasoning. How do we reason properly from one thing to the next? If one thing's assumed to be true, how do we discover new truths through the process of reasoning? Material logic is studying the matter of logic, the content of reasoning. And usually this is focused on whether it's true or not. So how do we analyze a statement and know whether it's true? And in order to do that, we focus heavily on the material fallacies, the ways in which our emotions or our biases or just poor language, equivocation leads to statements that are questionable, at least in terms of their truth, which doesn't allow us to reason properly. And so, these are things the students realize, these are things they've been doing all their lives. As they go through the course, they realize, okay, this is, in a sense, this is nothing new. And yet they've never stopped to really think about it and analyze it. And that's the value of the logic courses.
Now, have you found that you have had to, as the students are learning this and they're learning to kind of see these fallacies and maybe understand how they can be manipulated through ads and through speeches, have you found that you have to caution students and not becoming too proud and having some humility as they grow in their understanding of this?
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, it's humility is such a major aspect of this. One of the reasons why I love, and we're not talking about that right now, but the philosophy course, where I think it really humbles the students after learning about the great power and value of reasoning. And I really do want the students to really develop a certain, not necessarily pride, but fascination and delight in this great gift that humans have that no other creature has. And so I do want them to come out with that, this great, what a great creature man is. And yet, sure, they have to learn that it's not easy. And I think they do get that from these courses, that nearly everything people say is fallacious sometimes in a certain respect, because we're human. And I try to teach them that as well, that look, our emotions, our passions, our mistakes, our errors, everything else comes into how we communicate. And so we need, in order to have a rational discussion and to be generous to the other person, we do need to pull these things out and say, well, did you really mean to say that, or did you mean to say this, right? And so I think it leads to a greater humility if they use it in that fashion and don't just use it in order to constantly just strike down the arguments of the other person.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a process, right? Process for
Mhm.
everyone. And you learning to use the knowledge we have gained in a way
Right.
that's edifying to others, and that isn't just to our advantage.
Right. And if I could just add to that, I think it's one of the reasons why I really love this 6-year cycle. I think in a lot of programs, they will do, especially in classical education today, they will do a material fallacies class, and then it's left there. And what we try to do is to go beyond that and to teach them how reasoning is used in great arguments and great essays, how it's used in conversation and in dialogue. And that, I think, helps to sort of round out the education. So they're not just learning, oh, this is how people think, but they're all actually learning to apply it in very productive ways.
Right. So going back to the rhetoric, we talked a little bit about logic and formal and material logic. Now switching over to rhetoric. Now, why is rhetoric part of this kind of sequence of logic and kind of philosophy classes? I mean, isn't that rhetoric is public speaking and debate to some extent?
Right.
And so how is this rhetoric class, similar to a public speaking and debate class, and how is it different?
Yeah, it's in many ways it's very different, and it's partly in the intent, but the intent translates into how we teach it. St. John Henry Newman talked about how education is all about primarily about formation of the intellect, and yet if we only focus on the intellect, if we only develop people as being highly capable of reasoning, it actually ends up distorting them dramatically, because the human person is not just intellect. The human person is our affections, our heart, our soul, our desires. It's all of this is part of who we are and what we were created to be. And so reason is essential to knowing what to love, but love is an act of the will, and it's a choice to love and to care and to care for the other person. And this is where rhetoric comes in. And it's one of the things I try to teach them, is that when we communicate, it shouldn't simply be, like the baby communicates, in the very earliest age, where I feel I want, I feel terrible, I'm going to cry. I feel great, I'm going to laugh. I want something, so I'm going to cry for it, right? This is, it's based out of our needs and our desires and our feelings. But as human beings, we communicate in order to share what we've produced by our own reasoning, the knowledge that we've come to by our own reasoning, and we try to share that with other people. And that's just a great thing about human beings, that we are naturally social, and we are all leading toward communion with God, and we're doing this as a project together. And so rhetoric is all about the sharing of our reasoning. It's not good enough that you're simply able to think well. It's important that you're able to share those truths with others, and to do so in a rational and a truthfully persuasive way. And that's what we do in rhetoric. It's all about love for the other person and wanting to share what we know. And in order to do that, because the other person does have emotions, does have all of these things that somehow get in the way sometimes of pure reason, we have to do it persuasively. We have to speak eloquently. We have to speak clearly. We have to be able to do this in a good way. I mean, we all know the academics, right, who are so brilliant, but you can barely understand what they're trying to communicate to us. And that's not a good human situation. We should be able to communicate well and persuasively.
I love that. I think it really puts rhetoric in its proper place in light of our Christian faith, right? And this focus on doing this for the benefit of other people. Okay, so what about philosophy then? Some of these, then the more advanced level of these classes involve philosophy. A lot of people don't even take this in college anymore. Mm-hmm. And so why do you think this is so important?
Yeah, so we're not engaging in philosophy in the sense of rising to high levels of metaphysics and other things that a typical philosophy major or PhD would be rising into. What we are doing is teaching a basic understanding of reality. And that's really what Aristotle is all about. Those who reject Aristotle tend to reject the things that are real. There are obviously quibbles about some of the things that he said and how he explains certain things, and that's all part of the modern project of philosophy, is really always in relation back to Aristotle and before him Plato. But what we're trying to do in this class is really, it grew out of material logic, which is all about the content and what people are saying and what makes it true. And so we wanted a course that examined language, what it is that we say and how it relates to reality. And the fact is that very often our language is compromised. We make mistakes. We, just like in rhetoric, all these different things, our affections, our emotions, all these other things, or just equivocation, just poor explanation of things or poor definition, lead to arguments that really never had to happen because we weren't using language in the best way possible, in the clearest way possible. And so the whole course is studying Aristotelian philosophy about the nature of things, the form and the essence and the categories. How do we describe things? How do we put together propositions and make sentences that actually state something meaningful, which are propositions? As we do this, we're also talking about how does this relate to language? How does this relate to the various types of words that we use in language, nouns and verbs and adjectives? How does this relate to putting sentences together, putting paragraphs together, making a logical argument, stating a particular position in an essay? How does our reasoning and our understanding of reality, how do those things relate to what we're communicating in language? And so I just think it brings everything together for young people who for years have been studying language arts, have been studying literature, have been looking at all of these poetry, the best use of the best words. And now it puts it all together where, okay, that's what this was all about. That's what we were doing here. And that's why it's so very, very important, and why ultimately, if you don't know how to use language well, you end up contributing to falsehood and to misunderstanding of the world in ways that perhaps you didn't even realize you were doing. But it helps them to really value the importance of good language.
Now, have you found, I know you mentioned earlier that the 7th graders coming in and starting to take some of these logic classes might initially have a little bit of be a little bit shocked, but then eventually they really embrace it and love it. Now, have you found on the older levels that's the same as well? Because obviously when you're talking about these sorts of philosophical concepts, they're very abstract, and sometimes people still struggle on the college level with them. Have you found that it takes a period of adjustment for them, or the previous classes have really prepared them and they're ready for it?
Yeah, they chuckle at it sometimes, especially with the Aristotelian philosophy. We're talking about, principles of reality, that a thing is what it is. and they look at me like, Mr. Reilly, why are you telling me this? I'm in 12th grade. Why am I learning what a thing is, what it is? But as they get into it, they realize that these are the fundamental building blocks of everything that they know to be real. And sometimes, I mean, philosophy always has that effect on people. Sometimes it seems like it's up in the clouds, but it is, because the whole idea is to bring a higher understanding to the practical things of reality. And so, it depends on the student, but all in all, I've found that students really embrace it and do very, very well with it. And I have certain students who just eat it up. I mean, they're writing 3 times as much as they're supposed to on their homework just because they really enjoy it. And then you have others who are just going through the motions, but I really hope that they're bringing that into the rest of their lives, this basic understanding of things. And as they get older, they'll realize that it really is valuable to have this understanding.
So now we've been talking about 7th grade and up, but Aquinas Learning, as I know, since I also direct the center here, has a philosophy program for the younger students. And so it starts in 1st grade, which is very young. And I think most people are a little bit surprised that we have a philosophy program that starts that young. And even I think there are certain people in the classical world, to some extent, maybe based on the essay that Dorothy Sayers wrote, who think that young kids should only focus on memorization and that you leave sort of those abstract concepts and reasoning to when they're much older. So what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I think Dorothy Sayers obviously contributed tremendously to the resurgence of classical education, and there's so much in her writings that's very important to wrestle with. But sometimes, ideas can take a life of their own beyond what we know to be real. And the reality is that the kids, from almost the moment they can start talking, are asking the question why, right? They don't just want information, they want to know why. They want to understand why the butterfly flies and why the caterpillar does what it does and why it looks like it does and why is the worm so icky, and just they want why. And we, as Aquinas talks about how the human person in essence reasons. This is what distinguishes us from other animals, and that capacity for reason is in us from the moment we are created. It takes certain conditions to be formed, and that's why there are physical conditions that are required in terms of the growth of the brain and just the experience with reality that leads us to better reasoning when we're older. There's also the development of logical processes and understanding how reason works, and learning that through practice throughout our lives. But if you wait until high school or college to learn how to reason, you're at a severe disadvantage. And I would argue, once you enter typical adult life these days, you're so busy, you don't have much time to to learn a whole lot aside from experience, right? It's from one experience to the next and applying what you learned in childhood. And so the formation of what Newman called the philosophical habit of mind, the habit of rising above information and asking the bigger questions, and not just experiencing things, but asking why, and putting things together and comparison and contrast. We naturally do all of these things with young people throughout education. However, we don't often do it with the idea that we're cultivating that philosophical habit of mind. We just sort of do it by nature. And I think if we do it deliberately, which is what we're trying to do with Aquinas Learning, from the earliest ages, and we try to find the best activities and the best way of exploring issues, whether it's in science or literature and other ways, to cultivate those habits of good reasoning, then they become just much more human, much more capable, and much more able to find happiness, because they're better able to know it. They're better able to understand their world and not just flow with what pop culture tells them should be valuable.
And I love that that phrase, philosophical habit of mind. I think that is something that it's so important to be cultivating that in ourselves and of course, in our children as we school them.
Yes.
And I have found that my children have loved the philosophy class. And I have one son in particular that every week when I ask him what his favorite class was at Aquinas, it was always philosophy, because he loves asking those questions. He loves thinking deeply. And you're right. I think kids they naturally do that. They naturally ask why. They want to know the reason for things. And so they do have that philosophical habit of mind. But it's important to not stamp that out of them, right? And to cultivate it and to sharpen it.
Right. Yeah. It's also important not to, I don't want to give people the impression that we're asking them big, high level philosophical questions, or especially ethical questions. You have to be very, very careful about that with young people who aren't yet able to reason to the correct solution very well. It's the philosophy of the younger ages is what we would consider very basic why questions, right? Trying to delve into bigger things and do comparison and contrast and grouping things and categorizing things. This is what the mind does in order to rise to those higher truths, these universals that run across all of the things that we experience. And that's what we're trying to do in the younger ages. And maybe calling it philosophy makes people a little nervous that we're trying to ask them to do something that's much beyond their age level. But you do it at an age level, in an age level appropriate way.
Right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today on the Carolina Catholic Homeschool Showcase. Thank you so much, Patrick, for taking the time to talk to me. Please tune in, listeners, this week as we continue to explore homeschooling, classical education, the role of memory, and the importance of children's literature in forming the moral imagination. Thank you all so much, and God bless.